be here because this topic has affected me throughout my whole life. I grew up here in the 70s. I was verbally and physically attacked because of the colour of my skin, whether it being at school or whether it being in the streets. Now I'm targeted due to my religion. And my children are facing Islamophobia after schools, hence why I did that report, Islamophobia in Edinburgh schools. So I'm really excited to be here. It's the first time I'm chairing, so that's a bit nervous, but hopefully we'll do a good job. First of all, I'd like to really welcome and introduce the first speaker, who himself is the editor of the book, No Problem Here, I'm Designing Wisdom in Scotland. It's Neil Davidson. Neil lectures in sociology at the University of Glasgow. His research focuses on nationalism, with special reference to Scotland, on neoliberalism, sociology of revolution, uneven and compound development, contemporary class structure, far-right parties and movements. So, very talented person indeed.
Thanks. I think as everyone knows, this is a year of anniversaries. The anniversary of the Edinburgh Windrush arriving 70 years ago. The anniversary of Powell giving his famous Laws of Blood speech 50 years ago. And the anniversary of Stephen Lawrence being killed 25 years ago. All issues connected with race, but all issues that we associate with England. The Edinburgh Windrush fixed up in London. Powell gave a speech in Birmingham and was there before one of the Wolverhampton seats. Stephen Lawrence was killed in London. And that feeds in, I think, to a kind of view that we titled our book after, which is that in terms of Scotland, there's no problem here, or at least there's a lesser problem in Scotland than there is in England. Now, the origins of the book itself lie in a conference which 3 of us and 20 other people gave in Glasgow a couple of weeks before the independence referendum, the 6th or 5th or 6th of September 2014. And in a way, we decided to hold a conference about racism in Scotland because we were all part of, still are part of the independence movement and radical independence, obviously, at the time. But I think my colleagues at Glasgow, Maureen, Satnam Verdi, and Allan, were all also a bit concerned. There was a bit of that we're all Jock Thompson's bairns, faz like us sort of stuff, that Scotland was so wonderful and marvellous and there wasn't any of these problems. That came out in a real intensity, and partly, as I will argue, to distinguish Scotland from England in many ways. So we had the conference, and then tried to get a book published of a collection of the papers that Mark presented here. And we had extraordinary difficulties getting it published, which actually maybe feeds into the problem itself. I mean, it was sent out to academic review, and we got reviews back, I suspect, from a university not very far from where we were sitting, from people saying things like, well, there isn't a problem here. Or, well, there is, but really you've got to talk about it in relation to England. Or, yeah, it's a problem, but everybody knows that's what's the point of your book. I mean, really extraordinary stuff. Some of it probably just academic jealousy and manoeuvring and so on, but I think also indicating a real feel that this wasn't something that was even worth talking about, despite the experience that Smear's talked about, which is every day, for some people in Scotland. So we held a conference that involved academics, most of them were also activists like Allan is a retired gent, can afford to be an activist now in his full time, and that kind of middle ground of NGOs, think tanks, advocacy groups, and so on, it's a wide between the academic and activist kind of communities, we call them that. So, in doing the book, we wanted to bring this together, so it wasn't just a kind of pure academic exercise, but we did start from some theoretical and historical kind of premises. The historical ones are that racism, in general terms, isn't just always the same. It has a kind of historical trajectory, which starts off with slavery, in terms of its modern manifestations. Slavery and the idea that some people are basically subhuman, or are not fit to be treated the same as everybody else. And we should be clear here that Scotland has contributed significantly towards that view. David Hume, one of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment is a world historic event and so on, said something like, and quoting this directly, that I find it difficult to believe that these people could be men, talking about black people, right? And this is the Scottish Enlightenment. This is not like some barbaric figure. This is one of the great thinkers of his time. And he wasn't alone. I mean, Montesquieu in France, Hegel in Germany said similar things before and after. There's that idea and Hume was actually opposed to slavery as a form of economic organisation. He's never felt able to say that. So slavery, which feeds into the kind of races of empire, And here the tone is different. It's more about, not so much about the subhuman as about children. You know, we need to look after these people, we have to rule them, they can't rule themselves. At some point in the future they might be able to, but for this is the ideology, but for the moment we'll have to do this. Of course, that's also, the period of empire is also one of exterminatory attitudes of subhuman people. I mean, Tasmania, famously, the settlers, many of whom were Scottish, marched on a mile-long wall across the island, shooting every single native inhabitant of the island in the early 19th century. These are horrific acts of barbarism in which Scotland was deeply involved. And then finally, there's the racism of migration, of the problem coming home to roost, if you like, the people of the former colonies of Edinburgh coming to the metropolitan centres, mainly after, not exclusively, but mainly after World War II. Now, Scotland's also been involved in the racism of migration, but it's not something that's actually talked about in that way. I'll come on to this in a minute. So it's a kind of historical thing. I should say, though, it's not exclusively a Western or white problem. The Japanese Empire was brutally racist towards Chinese people and Korean people. In India today, there's vicious racism by some of the Hindu majority towards Muslims. So let's not, I mean, spoken about here in the context of Western colonial imperial rule and we used to call the Third World, but it's not exclusive to that. We need to be aware of this. Racism is something to do with capitalism. It's not something to do with just with the West in its relation to the rest of the world. Our theoretical assumptions, there's two of them really. One is that although people can display what we used to call racial prejudice or racial discrimination when I was with terrible misuse of discrimination, there were this kind of thing, which is that you don't like people because of a certain skin colour or something. Racism is that, but it's not just that. To be the kind of thing we're talking about, it has to be associated with certain kinds of power, with the state, with institutions, with the power to affect people's lives, whether they get jobs, whether they're going to be attacked and beaten up by the police, and so on. It's not just something about dislike. It's not just about people saying nasty things on Facebook. It has to involve considerably more a set of institutional structures to enforce it. You know, there are a lot of people who don't like English people, but English people are not oppressed racially. In Scotland, if they were, the lampposts of Edinburgh would be hanging with English people every August, and that doesn't actually happen. So it's, you know, it's not just dislike or prejudice that kind of way. It's built up a kind of power structure. Secondly, it's not just about biological difference. It's not just about skin colour or any other kind of biological factors. So that obviously very importantly feeds into questions of anti-Semitism, but also anti-Irish Catholic racism that Maureen's going to talk more about. And this is significant because there's a kind of way in which people, for example, shrug off making attacks on Muslims by saying, well, I can't be racist because Islam's a religion and Muslims are, have religious beliefs. And it's like, well, if you know, actually you're treating Islam as if it's a kind of characteristic thing that people have which permeates their behaviour and characterises everything they do. That's racism, whether it's accompanied with skin colour or not. So people can't let themselves off the hook in quite that way in terms of how they behave in relation to Islam or any other religious group. So, in fact, it's a very interesting example of this, it's sometimes called cultural racism, from Powell himself, who, although undoubtedly a deeply evil man, wasn't an idiot. He was once interviewed, I think in 1969, by David Frost. Okay, so this wasn't the most penetrating interview. You can imagine that at one point Frost said, Mr. Powell, you're a racist. And Powell said, no, I'm not. I don't think black people are inferior to white people. I just think they're different. And our cultures can't mix in that kind of way. You know, this is the argument from culture. I would have been, you know, the streets aren't the same as they used to be before these people arrived here with their funny food and all that. Caricaturing that. This is the kind of thing. So, I mean, Paul was lying. He had made several openly racist statements in his actual speech in 1968, but he was, I think, clever enough to see that he could get out of the obvious arguments of what racism was by saying it wasn't about inferiority, superiority, or even about biological, physical problems. It was about sort of difference, cultural difference. Okay, so that's the kind of basic theoretical positions we started from. Why is there an argument that there's no problem here in Scotland, or less a problem than there is elsewhere in Britain? I think there's probably three main reasons, and one of them comes back to the question of Ireland and of the Irish Catholic experience. Because although there was a very large migration from Ireland to Scotland in the 1790s and then again at the time of the famine in the 1840s and subsequently, that's not treated as a kind of racial issue by and large in Scotland. It's beginning to be now, partly because of Maureen's work and other people have been talking about that. But It's talking about under that peculiar rubric, we're talking in Scotland about sectarianism, which is partly derived from the Northern Irish experience as well. Now, the problem with the concept of sectarianism is it has this notion of equivalence. Protestants hate Catholics, Catholics hate Protestants, Rangers fight Celtic, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like two tribes, this is the kind of way it's pitched. But actually, they're not equivalent experiences. Irish Catholic, people of Catholic heritage in Scotland were discriminated against in housing, in jobs, in all sorts of ways. Until quite recently, actually, one of the contributors to the book, Allan who's now a professor at Aberdeen University, was trained as a skilled engineer, couldn't get a job in Glasgow in 1981 because of the school he went to, and had to go to, for God's sake, Forsyth and Fife to actually get a job at the kind of skills he was able to apply. And that's what, 35 years ago, so this isn't like the distant past. Now, all those kind of discriminations have largely stopped, as even Tom Devine, Professor Sir Tom back in Scotland's Greatest Living Historian, close brackets Devine, has noticed that these things aren't quite the same as they were 50 or 60 years ago. A recent article him and Michael Rosie did in the Sunday Herald. But that doesn't mean that a lot of those feelings of they didn't exist in the 18th and 19th century. The experience of Irish Catholic people in Scotland has been a racist experience, it's been an experience of racism. Well, we haven't talked about that. So a whole chunk of Scotland's history is kind of excised from the whole history of racism in Britain. The second reason, I think, is that, well, the Empire Windrush didn't dock in Glasgow, it docked in London. Actually, the numbers of people from the so-called Commonwealth, from the Caribbean, and from the Indian subcontinent, was very, very small in Scotland compared to Birmingham, London, Wolverhampton, and so on. Now, absolutely clear, it's not numbers that cause racism, right? But if there's a relatively small number of people from the group who are racism expressed against them, then it actually is much less easy to have these visible manifestations of it. It's also true that a lot of the people, particularly people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, did not tend to occupy jobs that were seen as being white jobs, like in the car factories and so on. They tended to be petty bourgeois, small shopkeepers and so on. And apart, I think from the buses, bus conductors and bus drivers was the only major area where there was kind of migrants in the Commonwealth occupied certain jobs. They weren't seen to be, they're taking our jobs kind of argument that was tended to be pitched in England. And so again, you were able to pretend that wasn't a problem because it wasn't so visible, because the numbers themselves didn't have any manifestations in the same kind of way as they did London and Birmingham. The third thing is actually to do with the struggle for devolution and then independence. And it's to do with, I suppose, the way in which some Scottish people felt the need to distinguish themselves from England. We're not England. We're not Margaret Thatcher. We're not these people with these prejudices. We were much, we're much more decent towards the people who live here. Everyone who lives in Scotland is a Scot. We're a mongrel nation, McIlvaney's famous expression, and so on. Now, this is, I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing. These are decent sentiments, and they express mostly a kind of positive view. I just don't think they're entirely true. But it did allow us, particularly on wanting to distinguish, I think quite falsely, English and Scottish politics, a kind of way of emphasising what was different in Scotland from England. And one of those differences was to argue that there wasn't the same level of racism as there was down there. Again, I don't think that's true, but it was something that allowed this notion to carry forward. And in a way, it's affected the way politics happens. The way that Orwell says something that a mask can affect the expression of a face. And in a way that the discourse around migration, for example, in Scotland is different from England. It's still quite instrumental. These people come here and they're good for the Scottish economy kind of stuff. But nevertheless, the poisonous nature of the kind of discussions you get in Whitehall and Westminster, there is a difference in tone, which does affect political kind of discussion, I suppose. But, big but, and to conclude my session, Scotland is still part of the capitalist system. Racism is produced ultimately by capitalism. And Scotland has many of the characteristics of an actual state. It does, for example, have its own police force. Recently, and that police force killed someone in Kirkcaldy. It was last year. 15 policemen jumped on top of someone who was black and had been wandering around the town quite instantly. So this is not something that doesn't happen here. I was quite shocked looking back at the figures for racial assault to find that the numbers in central Scotland, down to 2009, were actually higher than in central London. Now that is extraordinary, given the kind of legend there's no problem here. But it's slightly dropped now, but I mean, those are quite fantastic figures when you think about it. Now, what I suggest is that, and colleagues are going to talk in more detail about particular areas, but what we're trying to do here is open up a discussion, which is just beginning to really happen, to looking at this in depth. Particularly, we're very interested in comparing the experience of Irish Catholics and of Muslims, because we see these as actually historically separate, but actually quite similar experiences, and we want now to push out about this, and having started the debate, which I'm continuing here tonight, to actually to take this forward and explore the different areas about it as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. That was it reminded me when you were speaking that as a Scottish Muslim and speaking with the Edinburgh communities and communities from Glasgow, we do have this kind of sigh of relief. We're not in England because it's so much worse in England, and we ourselves as Muslims, we do have that kind of, thank God we're not in England, because we do see how bad Islamophobia is. It's a lot more violent. Not saying that it isn't violent here, but the level of violence and hatred that we hear from England is just it's astonishing. I would like to now ask Maureen McBride, who works as a research associate on the Children's Neighbourhood Scotland project at the University of Glasgow. She recently completed a PhD entitled Rethinking Sectarianism in Scotland at the University of Glasgow. She previously worked at the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research.
Okay, thank you to Rick Edinburgh for inviting me to speak this evening. Neil told me I had 20 minutes, but fortunately I speak quickly, so hopefully I'll get through the majority of this. So I'm going to speak about my chapter in the collection, which was written about midway through my PhD. And one of the objectives I had in my PhD was to explore the contemporary Irish Catholic experience through the lens of racism, instead of the typical sectarianism paradigm, which I argue, and as Neil has mentioned, is far too limited. So I'll start by providing some context for this talk, before outlining very briefly the historical background to Irish Catholic experiences in Scotland, and then I'm going to draw on some extracts from my PhD interviews with a small number of Irish Catholics who took part in my research, before reflecting briefly on the question of why there might be such resistance to considering anti-Irishness or sectarianism as a form of racism. So some of you might have read the recent argument that Neil mentioned from Michael Rosey and Tom Devine on the end of sectarianism in Scotland, so I should be retiring sometime soon. Their Herald column on April the 1st, and I'm assured it wasn't an April Fool's, suggested that while we, of course, need more attention in research on racism, claims of sectarianism in Scotland, contemporary Scotland, are largely down to some media sensationalism and, more importantly, a sense of Catholic victimhood. We just will not let go of the past, essentially. So for me, it's interesting, but really quite concerning, that just as Scotland is seemingly beginning to come to terms with its own racism, with its colonial past, that high-profile academics, really high-profile academics, seem to think it's time to sweep prejudice against Irish Catholics under the carpet. So the key argument of my chapter in the book is that in Scotland, sectarianism and racism are not two separate phenomena. So I agree with Jerry Finn's argument from back in 1990 that sectarianism is actually a preferred term for elite academics and policymakers in Scotland because it perpetuates this national myth that Neil's spoken about, that Scotland is a country free from racism. And I think that statement's just as relevant today. So despite being Scotland's largest ethnic minority, Irish Catholics have been largely absent in most sociological accounts of race and ethnicity in Britain, including the key sociological literature in Scottish society. David McCrone's Understanding Scotland only briefly touches on issues involving Irish immigration and integration into Scottish society. And those sociologists who have conducted research on and written about Irish Catholics and the literature on sectarianism, so the aforementioned Michael Rosey, Steve Bruce, very often reduce the debate to narrower focus on demographic changes, such as rates of intermarriage or educational or employment indicators. So although these are important, they fail to capture the more complex processes of cultural and social inclusion or exclusion. And it's something that's been partly addressed by Joe Bradley and Jerry Finn and others, but notably their work has had to constantly contend with accusations of Catholic defensiveness and partisanship, as though academics from the Edinburgh School write from an entirely neutral and objective position. So, and I argue that these limitations in the academic work on anti-Irish racism or sectarianism, or however we want to conceptualise the issue, influence the fact that claims of contemporary prejudice and cultural exclusion are frequently dismissed by political and media commentators. So a very short bit about the history, which Neil has already touched on. Irish Catholics were indeed depicted as an inferior race. There's much evidence to suggest that this took the form of old biological forms of racism, as well as attacks on their culture. They were demonised in the media, stereotyped as violent, backwards, accused of bringing disease and spreading criminality. And these narratives are, of course, not particularly unusual in terms of how certain migrant groups are negatively constructed. And thinking about the wider context of Irish Catholic immigration, their arrival in the 19th century came at a time of obsession with racial classification, and the Irish were regarded in some quarters as a threat to the native Scottish race. And their position in Britain was complicated by the colonial relationship between Britain and Ireland, which I think Allan's going to talk about in more detail, and the power relations associated with this. So having already been racialised in the Irish colony, processes of exclusion based on supposed racial inferiority helped to place Irish migrants as part of the unrespectable working class. And they became, in co-editor Satnam Verdi's words, a racialised outsider within the British nation. Moreover, as the British national identity was anchored to what Linda Colley terms an uncompromising Protestantism, defining itself against its Catholic enemy at home and abroad, both religion crucially intertwined with nationalism to symbolise what it meant to be British. And the racialised outsider status was exacerbated by the Catholic religion of the majority, obviously not all, but the majority of Irish immigrants. Am I sitting too far back? So their racialisation and the resultant economic exclusion and disadvantage made it very difficult for Irish Catholics in Scotland to move themselves out of poverty. As Neil has mentioned, they faced discrimination in the labour market, and anti-Irish racism was interwoven with various other types of discrimination and social division to keep Irish Catholics in an inequitable power relationship with a dominant Protestant majority. It's very well known, I'm sure, that in the interwar period, the Church of Scotland regularly petitioned the government with the aim of stopping further immigration of Irish Catholics, and even campaigned for the repatriation of some, such as those who were in prison. However, what is less known or less understood is that this use of language referring to the Irish as a race apart continued in the following decades. In his previous work, before coming to the conclusion that sectarianism is a completely moot point, Tom Devine did point out that in 1952, while the Church was publicly denouncing racial discrimination and promoting the rights of Africans in colonial territories, they still denounced Irish Catholics for, quote, displacing the native Scottish Protestant population from the industrial areas of the West, and they encouraged employers to discriminate in favour of the Scottish race. I don't, of course, dispute Rosie and Devine's claims that the 20th century saw a great deal of change. Several socio-economic shifts helped transform the lives of Irish Catholics in Scotland. Inequality was significantly addressed through the expanding public sector, the welfare state, and the educational revolution of the 60s. Changes in the labour market from the 70s and 80s removed much of the overt discrimination present in certain industries, as local family-based businesses were increasingly replaced by or accountable to national and multinational firms. And this vastly reduced the scope for employers to discriminate based on factors such as religion or ethnic background. However, what is less accepted, worth remembering, is that these shifts were incidental. They were a result of broader economic and social changes brought about by neoliberalism. These cannot be claimed to be an indicator of genuine attitudinal change. And it's also important to acknowledge the fact that these historic structural inequalities, again, as Neil has said, really not far back in the distant past, these are generational inequalities, were complemented by social and cultural marginalisation, and it's perhaps in these areas that the legacy of unequal power relations is most evident. So I argue in the chapter that the effects of historical discrimination and inequality don't disappear when the material conditions which facilitate the dominance of one group over another are dismantled. And to disregard evidence of remaining structural inequality for older generations of Catholics, and these do still exist. and the social and cultural marginalisation experienced by Irish Catholics of all ages trivialises the lived experiences of people who do feel somehow excluded in Scotland and sometimes feel the target of prejudice. It also results in an explanation of sectarianism, which attributes blame to the poor values of individuals by neglecting the past structural causes. So, although demographic shifts are important, they're limited in the sense that they cannot capture the processes of inclusion and exclusion. So, for the rest of the talk, I want to share some of the perceptions and experiences of the participants who took part in my research, as well as drawing in a couple of more high-profile instances of anti-Irish racism in contemporary Scotland. So one example, in January 2014, two young Irish-speaking brothers from Donegal were reportedly thrown out of a taxi in Glasgow because they refused to stop speaking in Irish Gaelic. In that same month, a man was imprisoned for 6 months for abusing journalist Angela Haggerty, calling her a taig and a fenian, which the sheriff called racist and religious. In both incidents, the victims of these attacks understood this as anti-Irish racism as opposed to some form of sectarianism. Irishness was what was being targeted, or perceived Irish heritage. And several of my research participants also felt strongly that the real problem in Scotland is anti-Irish racism as opposed to religious discrimination against Catholics. So in the words of one interviewee, I still think in this country we've got institutional sectarianism and institutional racism, and I use the word racism deliberately because they're discriminating against Irish, and that's racist. If you call someone a black bastard, that's seen as racist. If you call me a Fenian bastard, making reference to my Irish origin, that's racism as well in my book. So instead of religious aspects, participants emphasised other markers of difference such as place of birth, having Irish-sounding names, accents or language, or aspects of a person's appearance or the cultural activities that they engaged in. So whether you accept this in decline or not, and regardless of how it's framed, there was a really strong perception that Irish Catholics remain outsiders in Scottish society to a degree. And some of my participants noted personal experience of this, and I'm just going to focus on two short examples. So one interviewee, an Irish-born male who moved to Glasgow in the late 80s, spoke of feeling like an outsider when he heard the famine song for the first time, the infamous chant which includes the line, "The famine is over, why don't you go home?" I've noted previously the song was previously sung by Rangers supporters until it was banned in 2009 after being declared racist in a court of law, but I think sometimes you still hear it on occasion. So my participant explained, "I listened to this, it would come to me and it was jaw-dropping because for the first time I felt I was under attack in a sense. I was an Irish national and I was being told to fuck off home, you've no business here." And the song wasn't directed at him personally, he wasn't even attending a football match at the time. He strongly felt that this was an attack on his group, and he felt the sense of not being accepted in Scotland because of his nationality. Another participant, in this case a much younger male born in Scotland but with Irish heritage, described how he felt his Irish name was a marker of difference, one which may potentially attract negative attention. He explained that in his role as a taxi driver, norms such as his name being in Glasgow, his name being displayed on his taxi licence and given to customers when they ordered a taxi on a new booking system took on added meaning for him. So in his words, "I still feel the need to hide my name badge in the car all the time because I don't want them seeing my name. I would never have that on show. And now we've got, in this new system, we've got an app, and apparently it tells you the driver's name, so I'm actually kind of worried if I'm picking up from certain pubs and they see my name. I don't know if it'll say my second name, I certainly hope it doesn't, but it'll say name, and I just think automatically in my head I think they're going to be going Fenian taxi driver here." So this account, I feel, challenges the dominant sociological explanation of the position of Irish Catholics in contemporary Scotland. Because while structural economic inequality may be a thing of the past for younger Catholics, in this example there are clearly processes at work which impact on the behaviour of this participant going about his everyday life. And whether or not his concerns are groundless and influenced by stories passed down through generations, or whether they're justified, the reliance on demographic indicators by sociologists misses these lived experiences of individuals who feel that particular markers of their ethnic or national backgrounds might single them out for hostility. So in both of the examples cited, the participants spoke repeatedly of feeling like outsiders and not fully part of the nation they live in. So in the final 2 minutes, which is excellent timing, I want to use this example to reflect on the question of whether the kind of experiences I'm talking about should be conceptualised as examples of racism. And the participant who talked about his experience as a taxi driver compared it to what he imagines would be experienced by more visible minorities. So in his words, it's not right that you should be made to feel uncomfortable at your place of work. It isn't. But I dare say that a lot of Asian taxi drivers will find things 10 times worse than I will here when they pick up drunk people. So I guess it's not so bad. So there is an acknowledgement here that more visible minorities are more likely to receive negative treatment, supporting Mary Song's assertion that not all racial essentialisms create or reproduce structures of domination or damage or denigrate their target populations to the same degree. Clearly, avoiding being marked out as different by hiding a name badge would not be sufficient for many other minorities. So it highlights the fact that victimisation of people from an Irish Catholic background in contemporary Scotland is highly contextual. The potential threat of violence or harassment is greater in the case of my participant because of his job. It involves direct contact with members of the public, including picking up customers from pubs known to have connections to Rangers, but also to loyalism in some cases, Orangeism. And this wouldn't necessarily be the norm for most people from an Irish Catholic background in Scotland in their day-to-day lives. But to conclude, the fact that the institutional and societal racism faced by what some refer to as more visible ethnic minorities is more difficult to avoid than prejudice experienced by Irish Catholics has previously led to dismissal of people's lived experiences of oppression or prejudice as it's simply best perceptions based on some kind of historical story or paranoia with no real foundational basis. And I think that it's crucial that people's experiences and claims of prejudice are not simply dismissed because there are worse forms of it elsewhere. And I hope I've demonstrated through my use of participants' understandings and experiences instead of something that's entirely missing in Michael Rosie and Thomas Paine's work, that we should understand sectarianism as a form of racism instead of creating unhelpful distinctions between the two.
Thank you for that. That's one of you just reminded me of one of the arguments that I always had, especially when I was giving evidence for the new anti-bullying legislation, was that people of colour or people who wear religious symbols, we can't hide it. It's visual, and and that's what people react to that, and hence the abuse or these racial incidents that occur. So I feel it. I didn't know how bad it was. It's actually an eye-opener what you had to say to me. It really is an eye-opener, something that for me to go back and reflect. As a Muslim, I never even perceived that. So that was. Thank you for that. Okay, the next person, not least final person, Allan Armstrong. He's played a key part in Radical Independence and Radical Independence Campaign Edinburgh ever since it was set up. He's an editor of the journal Emancipation and Liberation. So, Allan, take the floor.
Yep. Thanks very much. When I wrote that article, it was in the aftermath of the conference that Neil talked about in just 2 weeks before the referendum. And, in some ways, people, there's two arguments here. This argument, Scotland has no problem with racism here. There's also, what about the Scots themselves? Where do they lie in all of this? Scotland pressing for independence from the UK, is that suggesting there's an unequal relationship here? So these two things came together. But the thing that I probably emphasised on that particular day was something that had changed in Scotland that was significant. The franchise for that referendum was quite interesting. Right? The franchise for that referendum wasn't people born in Scotland or people who had relations in Scotland. The franchise in that referendum was anybody who lived in Scotland that came within the terms of the widest definition of the Westminster thing. In other words, EU people all got the right to vote. Now, that was a decision that was taken by the Scottish government at that time. The British government was extremely happy they took that decision, because the calculation was, of course, Europeans will not want to be separated, and you will well know that a huge component of the No campaign is you'll be kicked out of Europe if you go independent, you won't be allowed in that. The other thing was, the other extension was from 16 to 18-year-olds. Now, you might think, oh, why did they do that? Again, it was definitely a more open view should belong, but why did the other side accept that? Well, actually, at the very beginning, when before the campaigns got off, they went around schools, and actually one of the Edinburgh schools was one where they had a debate, and the no vote won 80%, 20%. So they thought, good, young people, they don't want to be confined in little Scotland, they're going to... So they elect, the franchise was done on as broad a base as possible. And it's to the SNP's credit that they accepted a civic national view of who the electorate should be. It is to their credit, because it wasn't going to work out in the first case, certainly Europeans' advantage. In the second case, things changed, so the young vote did work out there. So what has changed over time? Because you went back to the early 80s, the SNP had an ethnic view of who was Scottish, just as it's always been the case in Britain. And the only changes that have been in British identity have been from racial to ethnic. In the mid-70s, as a result of the campaigns run by Asians, West Indians, they eventually became accepted as British, black British. They became accepted. Incidentally, of course, it also went along with accepting legislation that would clamp down on more migration. These two things were linked, but that was accepted at that particular time. And so from then on, the official view was, that if you're British, you're fine. It doesn't matter what your background, you're British, you're fine. It's those other people outside there, And that was when it came to the EU referendum, of course, it was directed at two groups of people. Obviously, people like East Europeans, but also people also lay outside, particularly asylum seekers. These were the people that it was directed at. So British identity has never got to the point of view of you're British if you choose to live here. Gordon Brown was trying to draw up criteria. How do you define Britishness on ethnic grounds? He was trying to find it very hard to do this because he was trying to say, well, we love freedom, we love fair play and all that. It's not exactly the historical record of Britain. So that was it trying to. So the SNP had made some change at that particular time. Let's just see how significant that change was. Because go back to the the early 80s. At that point, we just had, in 1979, we had a devolution referendum, and in that devolution referendum, hopes were built up that liberal reform of the UK state would have a home rule and devolved part and so on, and that, of course, was defeated. And in the early 80s, some rather unpleasant forces appeared in Scottish society. Groups younger people won't have heard of: Sean the Gael, Settler Watch, and these operated to begin with. That were in the SNP. To the SNP's credit, they were expelled. I mean, they actually expelled the left at the same time, but they expelled these right wing. So the move towards the idea that anybody who chooses to be Scottish is a significant one. So there are still limitations on that, but it was a significant one. Let's go even further back into history and find out when let's have a look at Scotland in 1955. People remember, young people and not us, will remember just a couple of years ago the amazing election result where this SNP picked 56 out of 59 MPs. That's just never happened in history before. However, it was done on a smaller percentage vote than the 50.5% the Tories got in Scotland in 1955, when people were Scottish and British through and through. It's the Empire-Union link that actually do it. If you want to still see in its horrific forms, go to Northern Ireland. Ulster British. These two things go side by side. Enoch Powell was mentioned. Now, Enoch Powell, had a huge impact at that particular time. London Dockers came out and marched for him. But as a result of the campaigns run by West Indians and Asians, which actually forced through some of that anti-racist legislation, Enoch Powell became a pariah, even in British terms. Not quite disappeared. Where did he go to? He became the Unionist MP for South Down. The forms of Britishness that he liked was still dominant, and he could be there. So these things are important. Now, once you start saying what does it mean to be Scottish, then, and is it something different from British, you've got the beginnings of a questioning of, well, what did that British part of our identity do for us? And it's entirely linked with crown, empire, everything. There's not a single positive thing linked with that idea of, historically, with Britishness. It's a state identity with access to accept a whole number of things, and in particular, the UK constitution doesn't even give sovereignty to people, sovereignty to the Crown and Parliament. There are still huge powers that we have no control over whatsoever. This is one of the reasons why the Brexiteers, when they campaigned, bring back power, give us back power. Well, we've seen how that power has been exercised since then. We just saw it over the Syria, the recent Syria vote. That vote didn't go to Parliament. It was done under the royal prerogative. More interestingly, though, at least that was visible. 2 weeks before that, it was reported that a British soldier had been killed in Syria. What? A British soldier killed Syria? But we aren't at war with Syria. What's it doing there? There are British soldiers involved there. Undercover. We don't even have to tell you you've got people there. He died, and so these are the sort of things going. Any of the votes on whether the Brexit deal is satisfactory, are not going to go to Parliament, and even the attempt of the present Scottish Government to question that. We know that if they've decided that they're not going to accept quite rightly the May's deal over that, and we also know that will go to a High Court, British High Court, and these things will be overruled. So there's a whole lot of deeply reactionary things go with that. Now, from a socialist point of view, where do we want to see that Scottishness going? The SNP is in two camps. The SNP, in actual fact, is half British, half Scottish. That identity, Scottish-British identity, wants to maximise the Scottish bit without entirely dropping that British thing. They still want the Queen. They still want us under the British High Command. They want us under all of these things. But if you want to push that further, you've actually got to say, well, who are we aligning with if we want to break away with that? People on Ireland, for over a century, people on Ireland have realised that the UK state is something that is, it's actually a lot longer than that, but they really don't work in their interest. But interestingly, in 1830, when Daniel O'Connell, who won Catholic emancipation, at that particular time, first time Catholics could vote and become MPs, he stood up in Parliament and said, I am willing to become a West Briton if you treat us equally. He said that. If you don't, I'm back to being Irish again. Well, we know how, in actual fact, they treated the Irish. And of course, when it came to the famine is one of those world historical disasters, like the Holocaust, like what happened to the slaves. It's in that camp. And I've just mentioned 3 things there. 2 of those, slavery and the Irish famine, are the products of the British state. On top of that, you could do the extermination of lots of Native American tribes in the Tasmania as well. So Britain's been right at the centre of some of the biggest horror stories around. So we've got to, in actual fact, start looking and say, actually, if we are wanting to break out of this UK thing, we're going to need allies. And there are people who have been around a lot longer than us, who've been a lot more affected by us, and they're the front line of the line of the struggle. And a new group, of course, that I would say is central to us is in Scotland, in the EU, all the EU migrants who are threatened as well. During that referendum campaign, it's interesting. People appeared on television, Brexiters, Labour. Another one said, one was an Indian woman, said, "Oh, I support Brexit. It's not, we're safe. We're Indian. We're okay. We don't want all these Poles and people like that taking our jobs." I think Windrush this week has suddenly given people, or the last week, suddenly given an idea that actually you cannot, these barriers are not there. You want to look to another group that, another group that you can actually see it's had its Britishness taken away from it. If you think of people who were defined as people who are Pakistani British 20 years ago, on the back of that, Baroness Wolsey emerged right at the top level of the Tory party. She's utterly been marginalised now because she's no longer seen as Pakistani British, she's seen as Muslim. And so her Britishness has been taken away from her as a result of that. And on the day after the referendum, the first referendum, independence referendum vote, if you had been part and parcel of its demand for Scottish independence, the day after you went to George Square, some of the Irish people, those loyalist and fascist people, the Irish people in Scotland have known about for a long, long time. If you were along there, actually, if you're not British, you're going to be treated the same as them as well. So, you're Scottish or Irish, you're going to be treated that way. That is what you're up against. And the other thing is how close that is coming to, if you like to hear, is look at the government we have in power. Tory DUP alliance. So the most reactionary forces, that at one time were actually kept at arm's length from each other, and now they're in the same government with all of these attitudes. So, and I just the last thing, just added Maureen's thing. One other thing, reason I actually do think sectarian, anti-Irish racism will reappear again is precisely because of the nature of the UK state and what is happening over in Ireland just now, with the threatening of a hard border. Once the consequence of that will come, as soon as that is resisted in Ireland, that will come to the forward. It will not disappear. It will come to the forward again. So all of these things are, linked. And in Scotland, we have what we've got to avoid is the 1980 situation. There are groups around now on the independent, like Scottish Resistance, that are anti-English. It's like they're going back. In other words, it's actually, you can have small-scale UKism in Scotland if you want. We have got to champion a much broader outlook and link up with those people who've gone through this experience for a lot longer than us, and we have something to learn from.